Around the 9th century BC, during the time of the kings of Israel, there lived a woman whose story would be remembered for generations. Her name was Jezebel. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, a coastal land north of Israel. Sidon was known for its rich trade, its ships that sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, and its devotion to gods like Baal and Asherah. Jezebel grew up as a princess, raised in a palace where idolatry and pride were honored, and where she learned to trust in power rather than the living God. She came from a culture where political power was bound to false religion, corrupting both throne and altar. Her father was not only a king, but also a priest of Baal. In those same days, the northern kingdom of Israel was ruled by King Ahab, son of King Omri. Ahab was a strong ruler who built cities, strengthened armies, and increased the wealth of his kingdom. But as part of his efforts to secure peace and strengthen political ties, he entered into marriage with Jezebel, the princess of Sidon. 1 Kings 16, verse 31. The marriage between Ahab and Jezebel was more than personal. It was political. In the ancient world, marriages between royal families created alliances. Israel gained a powerful connection with Sidon, and Sidon gained influence in Israel. Jezebel moved from her homeland to the land of Israel, leaving behind the familiar coasts of Phoenicia for the hills and plains of Samaria. At first, the people of Israel may have welcomed the idea of peace and strength that came through this marriage, but challenges soon followed. Jezebel brought with her the corrupt worship of her homeland, especially devotion to Baal, a false god she exalted as master of rain, fertility, and harvest. Ahab, influenced by her, built a temple for Baal in Samaria and set up an altar for him. 1 Kings 16:32. For Israel, this was a turning point. The people had been commanded by God to worship him alone, as written in the law of Moses, Exodus 20:3. The introduction of Baal worship created tension. Some people followed the new practices, while others stayed faithful to the God of Israel. This division in worship would become one of the great struggles of Ahab's reign. Jezebel, stubborn and zealous for idolatry, exalted the prophets of Baal and Asherah. She gave them food and protection. 1 Kings 18:19. At the same time, she opposed the prophets of the Lord. Some were even put to death during her time. 1 Kings 18:4. To her, it was the ruthless stamping out of Israel's faith, a direct attack on the worship of the Lord and the very identity of his people. In the midst of this conflict, a prophet named Elijah rose to prominence. Elijah was a man of bold faith who delivered God's messages to the people and to King Ahab. One day, Elijah declared to Ahab that there would be no rain in Israel except by his word. 1 Kings 17:1. This was a direct challenge to Baal, who was believed to control rain and fertility. For years, the land suffered under drought and famine. Crops withered, rivers dried, and the people grew desperate. Elijah, guided by God, hid during this time, first by a brook where ravens brought him food, and later in the home of a widow in Zarephath, in Sidon itself. 1 Kings 17:7-16. There, even in Jezebel's homeland, God showed his power by providing food for the widow, her son, and Elijah throughout the famine. Back in Israel, Jezebel fiercely advanced Baal worship, dragging the nation deeper into idolatry. To many, she was a ruthless queen, hardened in defiance against the Lord. Her actions filled the land with fear and corruption. The tension between Jezebel's influence and the faith of Israel grew sharper. Finally, the conflict reached its most dramatic moment on Mount Carmel. Elijah called King Ahab, the people of Israel, and the prophets of Baal to a great test. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" Elijah asked. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." 1 Kings 18:21. 2 altars were built, one for the Lord, one for Baal. The challenge was simple. Whichever god answered with fire from heaven would be shown as the true God. From morning until evening, the prophets of Baal raged, cried out, and even cut themselves in vain. But their false god was powerless, and no fire came. 1 Kings 18:26-29. Then Elijah prayed to the Lord, and fire fell from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water that had been poured over the altar. 1 Kings 18:36-38. The people fell to the ground, declaring, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." 1 Kings 18:39. This moment was a decisive victory of the Lord over idolatry. The prophets of Baal were exposed as frauds and put to death at the Kishon Valley. 1 Kings 18:40. When Jezebel heard what had happened, her hardened heart burned with rage against the Lord and his prophet. She sent a message to Elijah, saying that she would make sure he suffered the same fate as the prophets of Baal. 1 Kings 19:2. Elijah, though a man of great faith, fled in fear and despair, showing his very human side. The story of Jezebel during this time shows her as a woman of corrupt influence and ruthless determination. She was not a silent queen. She dragged the kingdom toward idolatry, stood boldly in defiance of God, and sought to silence the prophets of Israel. Her story reminds us of the great cultural and spiritual struggles that took place in the days of the kings. After the dramatic events on Mount Carmel, the kingdom of Israel entered a time of tension and fear. Elijah had shown that the Lord was the true God, yet Jezebel still held great influence in the palace. She was not a woman who repented. Her stubborn defiance and hardened will continued to poison the life of the nation. King Ahab, though a powerful ruler, often seemed torn between two worlds. On one side was his queen, Jezebel, with her idolatry, arrogance, and manipulative power. On the other side were the prophets of the Lord, calling him and the nation to return fully to God. This conflict became more visible in the years that followed. One of the most well-known events during Ahab's reign was the story of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth was a man from Jezreel who owned a vineyard near Ahab's palace. 1 Kings 21 verse 1. The vineyard was beautiful, and Ahab wanted it for himself, so he could plant a garden of herbs. He offered Naboth money or another vineyard in exchange, but Naboth refused. For him, the vineyard was more than land. It was his family inheritance, something God had commanded the people to keep within their families. Leviticus 25:23-28. Naboth's refusal was not an act of disrespect. It was obedience to God's law. Ahab returned to his palace sad and upset, lying on his bed and refusing to eat. 1 Kings 21:4. When Jezebel saw him, she mocked his weakness, questioning why the king of Israel would let God's law stand in his way. To her, God's commands meant nothing. Land could be seized, and power meant ruling without regard for justice or truth. With arrogance, she scorned him. "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Rise and eat. I will seize the vineyard of Naboth for you." Jezebel then took matters into her own hands. Using the king's seal, she wrote letters to the elders of Naboth's city. In those letters, Jezebel cloaked her wickedness in false religion, proclaiming a fast, placing Naboth in a place of honor, and then setting up lying witnesses to accuse him of cursing God and the king. By her deceit, Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death, an innocent man slain through Jezebel's treachery. When Jezebel heard that Naboth was dead, she coldly urged Ahab to rise and seize what her bloodshed had gained. Ahab went down and claimed it as his own. 1 Kings 21:15-16. To Ahab, this seemed like a convenient solution. But before God, it was murder and theft, a stench of great injustice. The Lord sent Elijah once again to speak to Ahab. Standing in Naboth's vineyard, Elijah declared God's judgment. "Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours." 1 Kings 21:19. Elijah also gave a prophecy about Jezebel. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. 1 Kings 21:23. When Ahab heard these words, he humbled himself. He tore his clothes, fasted, and showed sorrow for what he had done. 1 Kings 21:27. Because of his humility, God delayed the full judgment, but it was clear that the sins of Ahab and Jezebel would not be forgotten. Despite this warning, Jezebel hardened her heart. She defiantly clung to Baal worship and tightened her grip on power, showing no fear of the Lord. Her arrogance, boldness, and stubborn will were clear, but so was the corruption of using power without truth, justice, or the fear of God. As time passed, wars broke out between Israel and its enemies. Ahab joined with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, to fight against the king of Aram. 1 Kings 22:29. Before the battle, the prophet Micaiah warned that Ahab would not return safely. Yet Ahab chose to go, disguising himself as an ordinary soldier. In the battle, a random arrow struck him, and he died. 1 Kings 22:34-35. His blood was washed from his chariot at a pool in Samaria, where dogs licked it up, just as Elijah had spoken. 1 Kings 22:38. After Ahab's death, their son Ahaziah became king of Israel. 2 Kings 1:2. Jezebel remained queen mother, still poisoning Israel with her influence in the palace. Ahaziah, walking in the sins of his parents, clung to Baal and provoked the Lord's anger. He reigned only 2 years before dying from an accident. And then Joram, another son of Ahab and Jezebel, became king. 2 Kings 3:1. During this time, Jezebel's role in the royal family continued. She was a mother, guiding her children, and a political figure, shaping the direction of the kingdom. Even though Ahab was gone, her presence remained strong in Samaria and Jezreel. The prophet Elijah, after years of faithful service, was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2:11. His spirit and mission passed to Elisha, another prophet who would confront the kings of Israel. Elisha performed miracles that showed the power of God. He healed the sick, multiplied food, and even raised the dead. His ministry served as a constant reminder that the Lord was alive and active, even in the days when Jezebel's influence seemed strong. The conflict between the royal family and the prophets of God did not end with Ahab's death. It continued through his sons and through Jezebel's lasting influence. The story was moving toward a conclusion that had been foretold years before in Naboth's vineyard. For now, Jezebel still stalked the palace halls, arrogant and unrepentant. She had seen battles won and lost, kings rise and fall, and prophets challenge her family. But the word spoken by Elijah still waited to be fulfilled. The days ahead would reveal the end of her story, and with it, the lasting lessons of her life. One of the greatest challenges for Israel during this time was war with neighboring nations. The kingdom of Aram remained a constant enemy, and battles brought both victories and defeats. Jezebel's presence in the royal family spread corruption and idolatry without ceasing. She had been there during Ahab's time, and now she was there for her sons. But even with Jezebel's stubborn defiance, the warnings of the prophets thundered on. Elijah had spoken words of judgment years earlier, and the Lord's word was still waiting for its fulfillment. Elisha, who carried on Elijah's work, continued to speak boldly against the sins of the royal house. During Joram's reign, the kingdom of Israel faced growing unrest. The army, weary of constant battles, looked for new leadership. Among the commanders was a man named Jehu, known for his zeal, fierceness, and unstoppable drive. One day, while Jehu was with his fellow officers, a young prophet sent by Elisha arrived with a secret message. Taking Jehu aside, the prophet anointed him with oil and declared the word of the Lord. Jehu was chosen to strike down the house of Ahab and bring God's vengeance for the blood of his prophets and servants murdered by Jezebel's hand. Jehu's mission was clear. He was God's instrument to wipe out the dynasty of Ahab and to shatter Jezebel's corrupting influence. When Jehu told his fellow officers what had happened, they quickly accepted him as king. With furious speed, Jehu began his march toward Jezreel, where Joram, Ahab's son and Jezebel's heir in wickedness, was recovering from wounds in battle. As Jehu rode in his chariot, a watchman on the city wall saw him coming. Messengers were sent to ask if he came in peace, but Jehu's answer thundered the same each time. "What peace, so long as the harlotries and sorceries of your mother Jezebel continue?" The watchman reported, "The driving is like that of Jehu, son of Nimshi. He drives like a madman." 2 Kings 9:20. Joram came out to meet Jehu, along with Ahaziah, king of Judah, who happened to be visiting. On the field that once belonged to Naboth, Jehu declared God's judgment. Joram turned to flee, but Jehu drew his bow and struck him between the shoulders. Joram died in the very place Elijah had spoken about years earlier. 2 Kings 9:21-26. Ahaziah also tried to escape but was wounded and later died. Jehu's rise was swift and unstoppable. Now only Jezebel remained in Jezreel. When Jezebel heard that Jehu was coming, she prepared herself. She painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out of a window and spoke defiantly to Jehu. As Jehu entered the city, Jezebel called out from the window, "Have you come in peace, you Zimri? You murderer of your master." 2 Kings 9:31. She compared him to Zimri, a man who had killed his king and ruled only a few days before his own death. Her words were sharp, reminding Jehu that power gained through bloodshed could also be lost quickly. Jehu looked up at the window and called, "Who is on my side?" "Who?" 2 Kings 9:32. Some of the palace officials looked down. At Jehu's command, they threw Jezebel from the window. She fell, and her blood splattered on the wall and the horses, which trampled her underfoot. 2 Kings 9:33. Afterward, Jehu went inside to eat and drink. Later, he remembered that Jezebel was a king's daughter, and he ordered that she be buried. But when the men went to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, feet, and hands. Dogs had eaten the rest, just as Elijah had spoken years before. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. 2 Kings 9:36-37. Thus ended the life of Jezebel, queen of Israel, daughter of Sidon, wife of Ahab, and mother of kings. Her story was one of arrogance and corruption, marked by idolatry, bloodshed, and ruthless defiance of the Lord's commands. Jezebel is remembered not for greatness, but for wickedness. She was stubborn, manipulative, and unyielding, using her power to silence God's prophets and to drag Israel deeper into the worship of false gods. Her pride and cruelty left behind a trail of injustice, from the slaughter of the innocent to the murder of Naboth. In the generations that followed, her name became a curse and a warning. Even in the New Testament, Jesus condemned a false teacher by calling her Jezebel, Revelation 2:20, showing that her legacy endures as the very picture of rebellion against God. Jezebel was not merely a name in history. She was a real woman who chose evil, hardened her heart against the truth, and exalted herself against the Lord. Her sins brought ruin upon her, her household, and her nation. The story of Jezebel stands as a testimony that God's word is sure, his judgment is just, and his holiness cannot be mocked. Her life ended in shame and violence, and her memory lives on as a solemn reminder. No pride, no deceit, and no throne can stand against the living God.